Welcome back, dear friends. Before we begin, let me know where in the world you are watching, and please don't forget to subscribe and like to support the channel. November 2006. After 30 long years, the final payment was made. Quebec taxpayers had spent 3 decades paying off a debt that many of them hadn't even been alive to see created. The bill came to $1.5 billion. The cause? 2 weeks in the summer of 1976 when Montreal hosted the Olympic Games. But this isn't just a story about money or sports, or even about the Olympics themselves. This is a story about ambition and hubris, about a city caught between two identities, and about ordinary people who watched their metropolis transform before their eyes. This is about what it was really like to live in Montreal during one of the most dramatic periods in the city's history, and how a single event left scars that took a generation to heal. Close your eyes and imagine Montreal in the early months of 1976. Picture a city blanketed in snow, the St. Lawrence River frozen solid, and everywhere you look, construction. Not the usual kind of urban renewal, but something massive, urgent, desperate. Giant cranes pierce the winter sky. Workers in heavy coats operate machinery 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Steam rises from the construction sites even in the coldest hours before dawn. The sound of jackhammers and cement mixers never stops. This wasn't normal. This was a city racing against time, trying to finish what should never have been started so late. But to understand how Montreal arrived at this moment of frantic construction and mounting panic, we need to go back a few years. We need to understand what Montreal was before the Olympics came to town, and what the city hoped to become. Montreal in 1970 was Canada's largest and most important city. For over a century, it had been the financial capital of the nation, the place where fortunes were made and lost, where the country's major corporations kept their headquarters. St. James Street, the Wall Street of Canada, ran through the heart of downtown. The banks, the railroads, the shipping companies, they all called Montreal home. But beneath this veneer of prosperity and power, tensions simmered. The city existed in two solitudes. There were the English speakers who dominated business and finance, who lived in Westmount and sent their children to McGill University. And there were the French speakers, the majority of the population, who for generations had felt like second-class citizens in their own province. By 1970, something was changing. The Quiet Revolution had been transforming Quebec society since the 1960s, breaking the power of the Catholic Church, modernizing education, asserting French language and culture. But for some, this transformation wasn't happening fast enough. October 1970, the month that changed everything, a radical separatist group called the Front de Libération du Québec, the FLQ, kidnapped British Trade Commissioner James Cross from his home. 5 days later, they kidnapped Pierre Laporte, Quebec's Minister of Labour. The city of Montreal, this sophisticated metropolis of 2 million people, suddenly found itself under what amounted to martial law. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act for the first time in peacetime. Soldiers with rifles patrolled the streets. Tanks rumbled through neighborhoods where children had played hockey just days before. Anyone who lived through those October days remembered them forever. The fear in people's eyes as they walked to work, the sound of boots on cobblestones in old Montreal, the sight of armoured personnel carriers parked outside the Parliament buildings, and then the news that Pierre Laporte's body had been found in the trunk of a car near the airport. The first political assassination in Canada in over a century. Nearly 1,700 people were arrested without charge. The crisis lasted almost 60 days. This was the Montreal that Mayor Jean Drapeau governed. This was the city he wanted to transform into something greater, something that would make the world forget about political violence and separatist tensions. And he had a plan. A magnificent, audacious, ultimately disastrous plan. The Olympic Games. Jean Drapeau was a man of grand visions. He had already pulled off one miracle. In 1967, Montreal had hosted Expo 67, the World's Fair, that celebrated Canada's centennial. 50 million people had visited the fair over 6 months. They marveled at Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome, at the futuristic pavilions representing 62 nations, at Moshe Safdie's Habitat 67 apartment complex that looked like giant concrete blocks stacked by a playful giant. Expo 67 had been a triumph, putting Montreal on the world stage, showing that this French-speaking city in North America could organize an event of breathtaking scale and sophistication. Drapeau wanted more. He wanted to prove that Expo 67 wasn't a fluke. He wanted the Olympics. When cities compete to host the Olympic Games, they make promises. They promise modern facilities, efficient organization, financial responsibility. In 1970, Montreal competed against Moscow and Los Angeles for the right to host the 1976 Summer Games. The vote took place in Amsterdam. Los Angeles was eliminated in the first round. In the second round, Montreal defeated Moscow. The reaction in Montreal was jubilant. Church bells rang. People poured into the streets. The newspapers ran banner headlines. Montreal, already riding high from the success of Expo 67, would host the Olympics. That's when Jean Drapeau made his famous declaration. Standing before television cameras, radiating confidence, he proclaimed that the Montreal Olympics can no more have a deficit than a man can have a baby. The phrase would haunt him for the rest of his political career. A cartoonist named Aislinn would later draw Drapeau as a pregnant man, on the phone, asking for an abortion provider. But in 1970, as the champagne flowed and the city celebrated, no one imagined the nightmare to come. The initial budget was $120 million. This seemed reasonable. Previous Olympic Games had been profitable, or at worst, broke even. The facilities would be modest. Montreal already had excellent infrastructure from Expo 67. The city knew how to handle large events. What could go wrong? Everything. Absolutely everything could go wrong, and it did. The Olympic Stadium, the centerpiece of the Games, would be designed by French architect Roger Taillibert. His vision was spectacular, a soaring structure with a massive curved roof that would be retractable, suspended from a tower, rising at a dramatic angle. It would be unlike any sports facility ever built. Taillibert sketched his dreams, and Drapeau approved them without fully understanding the complexity, the cost, or the time required. Construction was supposed to begin immediately after winning the bid, but there were delays, bureaucratic delays, planning delays, financing delays. When ground was finally broken in April 1973, Montreal was already 18 months behind schedule. The Olympics were 3 years away. Now imagine being a resident of Montreal in 1973, watching this massive project get underway. If you lived in the east end of the city, near the planned Olympic site, your neighborhood transformed overnight. Streets were blocked, buildings were demolished, enormous craters appeared where excavation crews dug foundations. The noise was constant, but there was also excitement. This was going to be magnificent. This was going to put Montreal on the map in a way even Expo 67 hadn't managed, and it was going to bring jobs, thousands of jobs. The construction workers who showed up to build the Olympic facilities found themselves in the middle of a power struggle. Quebec in the 1970s had some of the most militant labor unions in North America. The Quebec Federation of Labor and the Confederation of National Trade Unions saw the Olympics as leverage. They knew the city was desperate to finish on time. They knew every delay would cost millions. They knew they had Drapeau exactly where they wanted him. The strikes began almost immediately. In an 18-month period between December 1974 and April 1976, labor disputes reduced the number of working days from 530 to just 155. More than two-thirds of the construction time was lost to strikes. To make up for lost time, construction had to continue around the clock. Picture this if you lived nearby. The sound of machinery at 3 in the morning. Floodlights illuminating the work sites, turning night into artificial day. In winter, heaters had to run constantly to allow concrete to cure in sub-zero temperatures. The overtime payments were astronomical, the heating costs were staggering, and, through it all, the price kept rising. 120 million became 310 million, 310 million became 600 million, and still the stadium wasn't finished. Architect Teilibert would later say that the construction of the Olympic Park showed him a level of organized corruption, theft, mediocrity, sabotage, and indifference that he had never witnessed before and has never witnessed since. He described it as a veritable cash register where every civil engineering firm involved knew they could just help themselves. Oversight was inadequate, accountability was non-existent, and during the inflationary 1970s the price of materials was skyrocketing. Structural steel alone tripled in price during the construction period. 12 men died building the Olympic facilities. Their names are rarely mentioned in the official histories, but they fell from scaffolding, were crushed by equipment, died in accidents that could have been prevented with better safety measures. Their families grieved while the city celebrated its upcoming moment in the global spotlight. By the spring of 1976, with just months to go before the opening ceremonies, it became clear that the Olympic Stadium would not be finished. The grand retractable roof? Impossible. The soaring tower that was supposed to support it? Not a chance. The Quebec provincial government, seeing the disaster unfolding, took over construction management from the city. 3,000 labourers worked in 24-hour shifts in those final scrambling months. They worked through spring rains, through heat waves, through exhaustion and pressure that never let up. If you lived in Montreal during those months, you could feel the city's anxiety. Would the stadium be ready? Would Montreal become an international embarrassment? Newspapers ran countdown clocks. Television news showed construction progress every night. People argued in cafes and at dinner tables. Some defended Drapeau's vision. Others raged about the cost and the incompetence. The city was divided, stressed, uncertain. And then July 17, 1976 arrived. The opening ceremonies of the 21st Olympiad, 73,000 people filled the Olympic Stadium. They sat in brand new seats in a facility that looked complete, at least from the inside. They didn't know that out of sight, behind the scenes, workers were still frantically sweeping up construction debris. They didn't see the last-minute touch-ups being applied to unfinished surfaces. They didn't realize that the grand stadium they were sitting in was essentially a giant facade covering a construction site. Queen Elizabeth II arrived, accompanied by Prince Philip and Prince Andrew. She wore a pink dress and smiled for the cameras. Pierre Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, was there, looking properly solemn and dignified. Lord Killarney, President of the International Olympic Committee, gave speeches about the Olympic spirit bringing nations together. The Canadian Forces Snowbirds aerobatic team flew overhead, leaving contrails of red and white across the blue summer sky. An estimated 500 million people around the world watched on television. The athletes paraded in, nation by nation. Greece first, as tradition demanded. The host country, Canada, came last. But there were notable absences. 29 countries, mostly African nations, had boycotted the Games. They were protesting the International Olympic Committee's refusal to ban New Zealand after the New Zealand rugby team had toured South Africa, despite the sporting embargo against the apartheid regime. Taiwan also stayed away after Canada refused to let them compete as the Republic of China. So the Montreal Olympics began with political controversy, incomplete facilities, and a mounting financial disaster that most of the world didn't yet understand. For the people of Montreal, those 2 weeks in late July and early August 1976 were surreal. The city was full of visitors from every corner of the globe. You could hear dozens of languages on any street corner. The metro system, expanded for the Olympics, carried unprecedented numbers of passengers. Restaurants were packed. Hotels were sold out. There was a carnival atmosphere downtown in the neighborhoods around the Olympic Park. Everywhere the games touched. The weather that summer was typical for Montreal, hot and humid. Temperatures in the high 80s, sometimes pushing into the 90s. The kind of heat that made the St. Lawrence River shimmer in the afternoon sun, that made people seek out the shade of the city's many parks and the cool interiors of churches and museums. For those who had tickets to events, there was the thrill of seeing world-class athletes compete. For those who couldn't afford tickets, there were television sets in every bar and living room showing coverage from morning until late at night. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation had 245 people on its Olympic crew, broadcasting from 9 in the morning until 11 at night, with breaks only for newscasts. And there were moments of genuine magic. Romanian gymnast Nadia Comaneci, just 14 years old, scored the first perfect 10 in Olympic gymnastics history. The scoring system wasn't even designed to display a perfect 10, so the scoreboard showed 1.00 instead of 10.00. She would score 7 perfect 10s during the games, winning 3 gold medals. The crowds went wild for her. She became an instant international celebrity, this slight, serious girl who moved with impossible precision and grace. Cuban runner Alberto Juantorena won both the 400-meter and 800-meter races, a remarkable double that showcased his versatility and endurance. American boxer Sugar Ray Leonard, so smooth and fast he seemed to dance around his opponents, won gold. The American boxing team dominated, winning 5 of 11 divisions. These were moments that made people forget about the debt, about the unfinished stadium, about the political tensions underlying everything. But there was one achievement that Montreal desperately wanted and didn't get. Canada won 11 medals during the Games, a respectable total, more than they'd won at each of the previous 2 Olympics, but none of those 11 were gold, not a single one. Canada became the first host nation in Olympic history to fail to win a gold medal at their own Summer Games. The disappointment was palpable. Canadian high jumper Greg Joy won silver in dramatic fashion, competing in the rain on the penultimate day of competition. The crowd erupted when he cleared the bar, hoping, praying for gold. But second place was all he could manage. If you talked to Montrealers during those Olympic weeks, you'd hear complicated feelings. Pride that their city was hosting such a magnificent event, embarrassment about the construction problems and the mounting costs, excitement about the international attention, worry about the future. The newspapers couldn't decide whether to celebrate or condemn. Editorials praised the organization while questioning the price tag. The French-language media emphasized Quebec's moment on the world stage. The English-language media focused more on the financial concerns and organizational mishaps. And then it was over. August 1st, 1976, the closing ceremonies. A colorful show with 500 dancers forming the Olympic rings, indigenous people setting up wigwams inside the rings as a tribute. Mayor Drapeau receiving a standing ovation from the crowd. The Olympic flame extinguished, the athletes departing, the television crews packing up their equipment, the visitors going home, and Montreal waking up to face the reality of what it had done to itself. The final price tag would eventually reach $1.5 billion. Some estimates put it as high as $1.6 billion, from an initial budget of $120 million. A cost overrun of more than 1,000%, the highest cost overrun in Olympic history, a record that still stands decades later. The city of Montreal owed $200 million. The province of Quebec owed $790 million. And the question became, how do you pay for this? How do you explain to taxpayers that they'll be paying for these 2 weeks for the rest of their working lives. The Olympic lottery had been created in 1974 as part of the funding scheme. It was controversial because lotteries were seen as a form of gambling, something that made many Canadians uncomfortable, but the lottery raised money, and after the Games, it was expanded. It became Lotto Canada, and it would funnel money toward paying the Olympic debt for years. But it wasn't enough. A special tobacco tax was implemented. Part of it went to the Olympic debt. Property taxes in Montreal increased, service cuts were made, programs were reduced, and still the debt loomed, enormous and inescapable. The Olympic Stadium stood incomplete. The grand retractable roof was abandoned. The soaring tower wasn't built. The stadium opened for baseball in 1977 without a roof. Montreal had been awarded a Major League Baseball expansion team, the Expos. In 1969, they had played at Jarry Park, a much smaller facility. Now they moved into the Big O, as it was called, though increasingly people called it the Big O. A roof was finally added in 1987, 10 years late. It was a disaster. In 1991, a 55-ton chunk of the roof fell after support beams snapped. Nobody was injured because it happened when the stadium was empty, but it revealed the structural problems that would plague the facility forever. In 1999, another section of the roof collapsed. The stadium was closed again for repairs. To understand what all of this meant for the people who lived in Montreal, you have to understand what the city was going through. In the 1970s, beyond the Olympics, Montreal was in the middle of an identity crisis. The language laws were changing. Bill 22, passed in 1974, made French the official language of Quebec. This wasn't popular with the English-speaking minority, who began to feel less welcome. Bill 101 would follow in 1977, further strengthening French language requirements. Businesses had to operate in French. Signs had to be in French. Children had to attend French schools unless their parents had attended English schools in Quebec. These laws were designed to protect French language and culture, but they accelerated an exodus of English speakers from Montreal to Toronto and other cities. And it wasn't just individuals leaving. Corporations began moving their headquarters. Sun Life, which had been in Montreal for over a century, moved to Toronto. The Bank of Montreal, despite its name, shifted more operations westward. The Royal Bank followed. The Toronto Stock Exchange, which had been smaller than Montreal's exchange, grew larger. Toronto's population surpassed Montreal's. For the first time in Canadian history, Montreal was no longer the country's largest or most important city. The economic consequences were devastating. But Montreal in the 1970s wasn't all crisis and decline. There was also extraordinary cultural vitality. The neighborhoods had distinct characters. The Plateau Mont-Royal, with its colorful Victorian houses and outdoor staircases, was becoming increasingly bohemian. Mile End was a mixed neighborhood of working-class families, artists, and immigrants. The Jewish community, which had peaked at nearly 120,000 people in the early 1970s, maintained thriving institutions. The Montreal Yiddish Theatre performed. The Jewish Public Library served the community. Little Italy around Jean Talon Market was vibrant with Italian bakeries, espresso bars, and families who had been there for generations. The Chinese community in Chinatown, though small, maintained its cultural identity through family associations and mutual aid societies. The underground music scene was alive with energy. Folk singers performed at the Yellow Door Coffee House. Rock bands played in bars along Saint Laurent Boulevard. The jazz scene was world-class, laying the groundwork for what would become the Montreal International Jazz Festival. Television was transforming culture. Radio-Canada, the French-language public broadcaster, was creating programming that spoke to Quebec's evolving identity. Artists, writers, and intellectuals debated the future of Quebec in cafes and at universities. McGill, with its English-language tradition, and the Université de Montréal, solidly French, represented the two solitudes that existed side by side, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes tensely. If you had walked through Montreal in 1976, you would have seen a city of contrasts. Brand new Olympic facilities next to working-class neighborhoods where families had lived for generations. Gleaming metro stations with modern architecture next to deteriorating housing. Streets where everyone spoke French next to streets where English still dominated. Expensive restaurants catering to the Olympic visitors next to cheap diners where locals ate poutine and smoked cigarettes and complained about the Olympics. Urban renewal in the 1960s and early 1970s had destroyed several working-class neighborhoods. The Red Light District, Goose Village, Faubourg Amlas. These weren't clean, picturesque areas. They were rough neighborhoods, sometimes poor, sometimes dangerous. But they were also home to thousands of people, and they were demolished to make way for expressways, for housing projects, for modernization that left former residents displaced and bitter. The Ville-Marie Expressway cut through the heart of the city. The metro system, wonderful as it was, had destroyed parts of neighborhoods during construction. Progress always has casualties. The fashion of the era reflected the times: wide-legged pants, bell-bottoms, platform shoes. For women, halter tops and maxi skirts. For men, leisure suits and wide collars. Disco was becoming popular, though Montreal's French culture gave local music a distinct flavor. Leonard Cohen, who had grown up in Westmount, was becoming internationally famous, his poetry and melancholy voice capturing something essential about urban alienation. At home, people had shag carpets, avocado green, appliances, wood paneling. The aesthetics of the 1970s, which seem so dated now, were contemporary and even exciting then. Winter in Montreal has always been serious business. The snow starts in November and doesn't really leave until April. The city has always been good at clearing snow, at maintaining services, at allowing life to continue despite the cold. But the winters during Olympic construction were particularly hard, not because of the weather, but because the construction never stopped. Imagine trying to sleep when there's noise all night from the worksite a few blocks away. Imagine the stress of knowing that your city was spending itself into a hole that would take decades to escape. When the velodrome, the cycling facility built for the Olympics, was converted into the Biodome, an indoor nature exhibit, in 1992, it became one of Montreal's more popular attractions. Families brought children to see the recreated ecosystems, to learn about different climates and habitats. It was a rare example of an Olympic facility finding a successful second life. The Olympic pool continued to be used for swimming competitions and public recreation. Some of the smaller venues were absorbed into the city's sports infrastructure. But the big white elephant, the stadium itself, remained a problem. The Expos played there until 2004, when the team moved to Washington, D.C. and became the Nationals. After that, the stadium was used for trade shows, concerts, occasional events. But it never fulfilled its promise. It was too expensive to maintain, too problematic to be truly useful. Around the world, other Olympic host cities were dealing with their own white elephants. The magnificent facilities built for the 2004 Athens Olympics fell into ruin with shocking speed. The Hellinikon Olympic Complex, where baseball and softball and other events were held, became overgrown with weeds, graffiti-covered, abandoned. The beach volleyball center and rowing facilities deteriorated. Greece's economic crisis meant no money for maintenance. Similarly, after the 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro, many venues were abandoned within months. The aquatic stadium, the velodrome, the golf course, all left to decay. In contrast, some cities managed their Olympic legacy better. Los Angeles in 1984 learned from Montreal's mistakes and turned a profit. Barcelona in 1992 used the Olympics to transform entire neighborhoods, but for every success story, there were more tales of abandonment and waste. Montreal's story, however, wasn't entirely one of failure. The metro system that expanded for the Olympics continued to serve the city well. The infrastructure improvements, the roads and bridges and utilities, benefited residents for decades. The international attention, despite the financial cost, did put Montreal on the global map in a way that had lasting effects. Tourism grew. The city's reputation as a cultural destination was enhanced. The experience of organizing such a large event built expertise that would be used in hosting other major events. The Formula One Canadian Grand Prix started coming to Montreal. The Just for Laughs Comedy Festival and the International Jazz Festival grew into major annual attractions, but the debt remained. For 30 years it hung over the city like a curse. Imagine being a young person in Montreal in 1976, just starting your working life. You would pay taxes toward the Olympic debt until you were in your 50s. Imagine being a child in 1976. You would finish school, start a career, have children of your own, and still be paying for those 2 weeks in July and August. November 2006, when the last payment was made, was a moment of profound relief. But it was also a moment tinged with bitterness. 30 years. An entire generation had lived under the burden of Jean Drapeau's ambition. What did Montreal gain that was worth the cost? The question doesn't have a simple answer. Some infrastructure improvements would have happened anyway. The metro expansion might have occurred even without the Olympics, but there were intangible benefits, a sense of having been part of something historic. Memories of watching Nadia Comaneci's Perfect Tens, stories to tell children and grandchildren about that summer when the world came to Montreal. Pride, despite everything, in what the city had accomplished. These things can't be measured in dollars, they can't be put on a balance sheet, but they mattered to the people who lived through it. The political consequences were significant. Jean Drapeau's reputation never recovered. He had been a beloved figure, a man who had brought Expo 67 to Montreal, who had modernized the city. But the Olympic disaster tarnished his legacy. The Parti Québécois, the separatist party, gained support. René Lévesque became Premier of Quebec in 1976, just months after the Olympics. The failed economic model of the Olympics seemed to validate arguments that Quebec would be better off independent. The sovereignty movement grew stronger. In 1980, there was a referendum on Quebec independence. It failed, but it was close enough to show how divided the province had become. The English-speaking exodus continued through the 1980s and 1990s. Montreal became a more French city, which was the goal of the language laws, but it also became smaller relative to Toronto. The headquarters of major corporations were gone. The financial power had shifted. Montreal remained a cultural capital, still vibrant, still beautiful, still full of life and energy. But it was no longer the unquestioned centre of Canada. That role had been ceded to Toronto, partially because of decisions made in the 1970s, partially because of the Olympic debt that constrained Montreal's development for 3 decades. There were, oddly enough, some unexpected legacies. The skateboard pipe that had been the entrance to Olympic Park became famous in skateboarding circles. Skaters from around the world made pilgrimages to ride it. Among skateboarders, it was a legendary spot. The Big O became a symbol in popular culture, referenced in articles and books about Olympic failures and urban planning mistakes. Urban planners studying how not to host the Olympics inevitably looked at Montreal as a cautionary tale. The neighborhoods around the Olympic site changed over the years. The East End of Montreal, historically working class and French-speaking, gentrified in some areas, remained affordable in others. The Olympic Stadium sat there, this enormous concrete presence, neither beautiful nor useful, too expensive to tear down, too problematic to truly repurpose. It was maintained, events were held there, but it never became what it was supposed to be. The tower, finally completed decades late, offers views of the city. Tourists go up in the inclined elevator and look out over Montreal, over the St. Lawrence River, over the bridges connecting the island to the mainland. The people who were children during the 1976 Olympics grew up and had their own children. They told stories about watching the games on television, about the excitement of having the world's attention, about the years afterward when everyone complained about the debt. Some remembered it fondly as a time when Montreal still thought of itself as the centre of Canada. Others remembered it bitterly as the beginning of decline, the moment when ambition exceeded capability. Both memories were true in their way. The lessons of Montreal 1976 influenced how the Olympic Games evolved. The International Olympic Committee realized that asking cities to build elaborate facilities from scratch was unsustainable. Future Olympics made more use of existing venues. Los Angeles 1984 was privately funded and profitable. Atlanta 1996 repurposed most of its Olympic venues. London 2012 planned for legacy use from the beginning. Paris 2024 decided not to build a new Olympic village, using existing buildings instead. Every Olympics since Montreal has been compared to it, at least financially. How much is this costing? Will it turn into another Montreal? The stadium still stands, you can see it from various points in Montreal, this enormous oval rising from the landscape. At night, it's sometimes lit up, a beacon visible for miles. During the day, it looks tired, dated, like a relic from an era that believed in grand gestures and didn't count the cost. The biodome next to it is more successful, more loved, more useful. The Olympic Park as a whole is pleasant enough with walking paths and green spaces. In summer, concerts are held. In winter, it's quiet except for those using the indoor facilities. It's not abandoned like so many other Olympic sites around the world, but it's not what it was supposed to be either. If you could talk to someone who lived through it all, from the excitement of winning the bid in 1970 to the final debt payment in 2006, they would probably express complicated feelings. Regret about the financial burden, pride in moments of genuine success, frustration with the corruption and incompetence, nostalgia for a time when Montreal believed it could accomplish anything, sadness at how much was lost. These Olympics were supposed to showcase Montreal as a modern, sophisticated, bilingual city that could organize world-class events, and in some ways they did. The organization of the games themselves, the sporting competitions, the cultural program, these were successful. But the financial disaster overshadowed everything else. The construction workers who built the Olympic facilities, the ones who survived the dangerous conditions, went on to other jobs, other projects. Some of them were proud of their work. They built something that thousands of athletes used, that millions of people watched on television. They were part of history, even if the history was complicated. The labor unions that struck repeatedly during construction argued that they were fighting for workers' rights, for fair wages and safe conditions. And they weren't wrong, but the cost was measured in delays and overruns that the city couldn't afford. The architects and planners who designed the Olympic facilities had their visions compromised by budget constraints, by construction problems, by the reality that grand designs don't always translate into practical buildings. Roger Taillibert, the French architect, was bitter about how his masterpiece was executed. He saw his vision degraded by incompetence and corruption, but he also designed something that was too complicated, too expensive, too ambitious for the time and place. Both things can be true. The politicians who approved the Olympics, who made promises about costs and benefits, learned hard lessons, or they should have. Some, like Jean Drapeau, never really accepted responsibility for the disaster. They blamed others. They claimed circumstances beyond their control. But the reality is that the Olympics were a choice. Montreal could have bid more conservatively, with more realistic plans. The city could have pulled out when costs started spiraling. These choices were made by people, and those people were accountable, even if they never admitted fault. The athletes who competed in Montreal mostly didn't know or care about the financial problems. They were there to compete, to represent their countries, to pursue Olympic dreams. For Nadia Comaneci, Montreal was the beginning of international fame. For Sugar Ray Leonard, It was a stepping stone to a legendary professional career. For Alberto Juantorena, it was the highlight of his athletic life. They weren't responsible for the debt. They performed as they were asked, and their performances gave people moments of joy and excitement during those 2 weeks when the Olympics distracted from everything else. The journalists who covered the Olympics told the world what was happening in Montreal. The Canadian media, both French and English, tried to balance pride in hosting with criticism of the costs. International media were generally kind, focusing on the successful sporting events rather than the financial disaster unfolding behind the scenes. But over time, as the true costs became clear, Montreal's Olympics became synonymous with Olympic excess and failure. For those interested in urban planning and public policy, Montreal 1976 became a case study in what happens when ambition isn't matched by realistic planning and fiscal responsibility. Universities teach courses that include the Montreal Olympics as an example of project management failure. Books have been written analyzing what went wrong and why. The lessons are clear. Don't underestimate costs. Don't underestimate time needed. Don't assume everything will work out. Don't let ambition override common sense. These lessons seem obvious in hindsight, but in 1970, when Montreal won the bid, people genuinely believed the Olympics could be done for $120 million. They genuinely believed in Jean Drapeau's assurances. They wanted to believe. The Quebec identity, so central to understanding Montreal in the 1970s, continued to evolve. The separatist movement had its moment in 1995, when another referendum on independence came frighteningly close to passing. It lost by less than 1% of votes cast. Had it passed, Canada would have broken apart, and Montreal would have become the capital of an independent Quebec. But it failed, and Quebec remained part of Canada. The language laws remained. French remained dominant in Montreal and throughout Quebec, but the apocalyptic fears of the 1970s faded. Montreal and Quebec found ways to maintain their distinct identity within Canada. Today, Montreal is thriving in ways that would have surprised people in 1976. The city has reinvented itself as a center for technology, for artificial intelligence research, for video game development. The neighborhoods that were gentrifying in the 1970s are now expensive and desirable. The art scene remains vibrant. Montreal is consistently ranked as one of the world's most livable cities. The bilingual character that once seemed like a source of conflict is now seen as an asset. Young people from across Canada and around the world move to Montreal for its culture, its nightlife, its relatively affordable cost of living compared to Toronto or Vancouver. The Olympic debt is paid. The stadium still stands, still problematic, still there. But it doesn't define Montreal anymore. It's part of the city's history, a reminder of a particular moment when ambition exceeded capability, when dreams met reality and reality won. But Montreal survived. The city that worried it would be crushed by Olympic debt found ways to thrive despite it. The resilience of Montrealers, their ability to adapt and reinvent, proved stronger than the burden of one disastrous decision. If you visit Montreal today, you can still see echoes of that Olympic summer. The metro, stations built or expanded for the Games, still carry passengers every day. The Olympic Park is there, with its troubled stadium and its successful biodome. The neighborhoods that were transformed by construction have their own character now, shaped by decades of change. The older generation remembers. They remember the excitement and the disappointment, the pride and the embarrassment. They paid the debt, literally, through their taxes for 30 years. The younger generation knows it as history. They've heard the stories, but they didn't live through it. For them, Montreal's identity isn't defined by Olympic failure. It's defined by what the city is now, by its multiculturalism, its creativity, its unique place in North America as a French-speaking metropolis that also embraces English and dozens of other languages. They know the stadium is there, but they don't obsess about it. It's just part of the landscape. The story of Montreal's 1976 Olympics is a human story. It's about the people who lived through extraordinary times, who watched their city change in ways they couldn't control, who paid the price for decisions made by others. It's about workers who built impossible structures under dangerous conditions. It's about families who struggled with the economic burden. It's about communities that were displaced or transformed. It's about a city that dreamed big and paid dearly for those dreams. But it's also a story about resilience and adaptation. Montreal didn't die from Olympic debt. The city survived, changed, evolved. The experience shaped the city's character, made people more skeptical of grand promises, more careful about large projects. These lessons were valuable, even if they were expensive to learn. And in learning them, Montreal grew into something different from what it had been, something that could face the future with more realism and less naivety. As you drift off, think about Montreal in the summer of 1976. The construction sites finally quiet. The Olympic rings displayed proudly throughout the city. Athletes from around the world competing in the sun, crowds cheering in multiple languages. A city that for 2 weeks was the center of global attention. And then think about the 30 years that followed, the slow, patient work of paying off a debt, of rebuilding confidence, of finding a new identity. Montreal's Olympic story doesn't have a simple moral. It's complicated and messy and human, but that's what makes it worth remembering. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through Montreal's Olympic history, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into fascinating moments in history. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you have any memories or stories about the 1976 Olympics or about Montreal. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next video.